so blue. I really don't know what to do. I got a brand new job, a tip collector, it's some job. A car protector since I left my home and started on railroads to roam. I get nothing but abuse. So tell me what's the use? It's Pullman Porter, draft on my feet. It's Pullman Porter, tied on the heat. It's Pullman Porter, all the livelong day. It's Pullman Porter, bring me water, that is all that it say. It's Pullman Porter, make up my mind. It's Pullman Porter, no peace on earth. Oh, Pullman Porter, won't you shine my shoes? I've got the Pullman Porter blues. Every time I see an engine coming down the track, I get so doggone lonesome that I wish I was back. Listen to the whistle, Lordy, Lordy, what a thrill. I wish I was in Dixie.
As part of Black History Month, the Dauphin Rail Museum is pleased to present a conversation with Naomi Dennie. Naomi is an elementary school teacher in Seven Oaks School Division on Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Naomi has been a member of the Black History Manitoba Committee for the past 2 years. She actively contributes by coordinating events and collaborating with the Manitoba and Children's Museum to enhance their Black History educational programs. Naomi is also the creator of educational podcast entitled Amplify Us, which aims to amplify the voices and experience of Black Canadians within the educational system. Throughout the year, you can also find Naomi engaged in professional development opportunities through her school and divisional anti-racism committees. Naomi has a passion for education and is committed to promoting diversity and cultural awareness through the experiences of Black Canadians. Without further ado, here is our conversation. So welcome, everybody. I have Naomi here, kind enough to join me. So hi, Naomi. We have a interesting story of how we finally connected. It's been a year plus, so thank you. You're a busy person, I know.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. So just to give a little backstory of why I've reached out and why I think it's important that we're having this little talk or educational moment between us. So I've been the Rail Museum president for 5 years and always loved history. But then in 2019, there was an interview on CBC Radio Manitoba, or Winnipeg, pardon me, about the book They Call Me George, with the author Cecil Foster, and it just blew me away. I did not know the history, the basically effort, the discrimination, the resilience, all these stories, right? And it just how integral it was to building Canada. Is, you know, my view is how important rail history is to Canada, to North America. But this was a story that I didn't know much about. And then I thought, just becoming president of the museum, that it's important to tell these stories. And we're dealing with truth and reconciliation and trying to get all stories. History is not all rainbows and unicorns. Like there's a lot of real person stories. So so I've reached out to you, and maybe you can give me a little context of, say this, how did you get first interested in learning about the story of the sleeping car porters in Canada?
Mm-hmm. Well, honestly, like it all kind of started with a university essay.
Okay.
We were asked to basically look into the history of Winnipeg through photos. And so I had this collection of photos in front of me, and I was flipping through trying to find something that would, you know, pique my interest. And from there, actually stumbled upon a photo of probably over a dozen Black railway porters. At the time, I didn't know that's what they were, right? And but they were actually standing right outside the Old of Montreal building, and they were all, you know, they were all in their uniforms, and there was instruments around, and I was very curious, and so I looked at that and I thought, oh, well, this is definitely like, I don't know when this photo was, but let me just take the date. And it was like early 1900s, like 1920s. And I was like, whoa, this is really interesting. I had no idea that there were Black people in Winnipeg at the time. Like, were the men here the porters, or were they traveling? Like, who are the porters? Like, I had so many questions. And so I ended up doing my report on the porters. And at the time, I just tried my best to get as much information as I could. It was very kind of surface level, where the picture came from, who the porter were. But I still was like very new to this history. And I, for one, was just like, okay, I'm a Black person in Winnipeg. I've lived here all my life. I haven't been taught this history. This is something that I believe everyone should learn about. And I think this picture
Absolutely.
itself should just be put up somewhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was just quite excited. And I did this essay. I got a really good mark on it, by the way, which was awesome.
Excellent. Yes, that helps.
Yes, it was really good. Yeah. But I was quite interested in the research, and my professor was really willing to help me. And, I started to look into more books and articles and got a little bit deeper into this history. And now it's 2024, if you can believe it or not, and I'm still learning more as much as I can about the porters. And I've been on different projects learning about them. I've, you know, been in contact with the Manitoba Museum and with Black History Manitoba just to kind of mesh this history together. And I've talked to families who have had their rich history in Winnipeg through the porters. So it kind of started with a project in university, and it's gone all into this
Down the rabbit
this
hole.
all outreach that I've been doing. Exactly.
Excellent. And it
Yeah,
shows
this
like
rabbit
just
hole.
one picture, how it can then open up this whole world. So that's awesome. And
Right.
you maybe not knowing the rail history, especially with Winnipeg, right? So Winnipeg basically being known as the Chicago of the North and being in the center of the continent, such a real rich rail history. And I think that's the important thing for me, wanting to shed light on some of these stories that people don't know about, just the significance and legacy of the porter. So I don't know, once again, I don't know if you can speak to, or because I know you've presented, correct? But just speaking to that story of resilience, determination, what they represented to, their families or the Black people in the community, just for one, having that job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would definitely say is a story of resilience and so much drive, right? And I feel from the story we'll hear like about activists, like the birthplace of a lot of activism, and especially within PEG, like there was so much supporters have united the Black community. And I feel some of these stories are still ongoing. We're still unpacking them, right?
Absolutely.
So really, I would just like to share a few things that really have connected with me. As I was learning about this history, I was in contact with Roland Sawatsky, who was one of the curators of history at the Manitoba Museum, as well as other people, and reading stories and reading books and articles. And there's a book that I used quite a lot, like in research, and then even after I had graduated, I was still reading this story. It's called North of the Color Line, and it's by Sarah Jane Matthew.
Okay.
The story is just, it's so rich in the history of Black people here in Canada. But the focal point that I really found to be significant for myself was looking into the history of the porters. And, from there, we learned that there was an influx of Black people who came into Manitoba for the railway industry, right? The
Just purely
Chicago of the
for
North,
that. Yeah.
Winnipeg. Exactly, right. And coming here expecting, maybe to have good jobs for their families and everything, right? And a lot of the Black people ended up settling in and around the area of Portage and Main Street. And, if you go down there now, you wouldn't quite know that that's actually quite a historical Black community. But in that area, you had families living there, you had boarding houses, you had restaurants that were all catered to the Black community, when at a time when there weren't other organizations, the places that were quite as accepting to the Black community. And so you have these families that moved into Winnipeg, to get be part of the rail industry. But unfortunately, a lot of the jobs that the Black men expected to be doing were things that they probably weren't even, they were more qualified for. A lot of the families that came into Winnipeg, they had tremendous backgrounds in degrees and things like that, educators, all these different things. But the jobs that they received here were to be porters on the trains, right? And the jobs as porters on the trains were quite tasking. They were
Grueling to
really
say the
difficult
least.
jobs, grueling,
Yeah.
exactly, right? Like
So you're looking
if
at
that's even
4 hours of sleep a night, things
if
of
they
that
even sleep.
nature. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly, right. And if they had that sleep, right. And I even was reading something where a porter was, meant to sleep in the corner of the train. And even if they were to have any sleep at all, that was their place, to
In that
sleep
position.
in the
Yeah.
corner. Exactly, right. And they did to all these passengers, right, were subjected to be called the name George, which wasn't their name, but it's the name after George Pullman, who created the Pullman, cars and everything, the sleeper
Down in
trains,
the
right?
U.S. Shortly after the Civil War. Yep.
Exactly, right. So it's all kind of like tied into American history as well, right?
Absolutely.
There's so many things, even if you consider like their wages, it's a job, so it's what they did, right? But it wasn't always enough and sufficient for their families, but it was also one of the only jobs that they could have at the time. Um, and I think about many Black families there who had like relatives, a father, an uncle, a grandfather who worked as porters for Canadian National Railway or Canadian Pacific Railway, right? And because it was that only job that they could provide for their family at the time, right? But even though you may look at it as like, okay, wasn't the best opportunity for them, they made an opportunity for themselves through that,
Absolutely.
which I find is quite exciting, right? So you had many Black porters come together. You had the porters band, which is quite interesting. Uplift the community, right? Get together in song, right, and dance and community things like
And,
that.
and if I may touch
But
on that,
then,
one cool
yeah, go ahead.
aspect that I learned about, I'm a huge music fan. So you think of that as a form of travel that
Mm,
really only existed to go far distances, right? So say you had a porter going from Montreal to Vancouver. I had read
mm,
stories about how, say, music, for instance, they would
mm,
travel, pick up records in different cities, and then say from Vancouver, bring it to Montreal, or even newspaper clippings. And so culturally, how incredible it was because they were transferring what was
mm,
going on in different communities as porters
mm.
to, say, the Black community in Winnipeg or Montreal or Vancouver.
Yeah, exactly. So you have that cross Canada, communication and everything, and just kind of like a sense of community, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I
Um,
think to like,
no, go ahead. Sorry.
oh yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna.
No, I was
We.
just gonna.
Oh, sorry. There's a delay. No problem. No problem.
Yeah,
Um, we were touching a
go
little
ahead.
bit on and just making a point of like the differences, and we sometimes, it's the racial component of porters could only move up the ranks as a porter. They couldn't become an engineer. They
Mm,
couldn't be up, and so that's, I think,
mm,
one of the huge pillar elements in Canada is their struggle to obtain rights through labor law.
mm,
And so can you
mhm,
speak a little bit to, what they achieved just as a group? Because there were
mhm,
so many of them that once they banded together on a concerted front, like the railways had to kind of listen to them.
yeah. So before 1917, I'll speak on that a little bit. The Brotherhood of Railway Employees was quite restricted to white employees only. It was like a union,
Hmm.
basically, right? And um, you think of the porters themselves thinking, okay, well, we're not getting the right wages. We are being discriminated against. There's lots of racism. I don't like this job. All these things that they're facing, right? The race and the discrimination, thinking about families not being able to provide enough. And it's quite risky to fight back at that time. Right? You could lose your job and then you lose your livelihood and
Hmm.
all these things, right? But while it was risky, actually the first Black union in Canada was also created in 1917, which was called the Order of Sleeping Car Porters. And it was started by four Winnipeg porters named John Ashley Robinson, J.W. Barber, B.F. Jones, and P. White. Don't have all their names, but we'll just use that for now.
Yep. Yep.
And we found that it was like the first Black union in Canada, and it became like such a trailblazing opportunity to start many different activisms and organizations throughout Canada for Black people, right? Like it started here in Winnipeg, and it kind of ignited this spark between the Black community. Like, hey, this is something that we need to do. We need to stand up for our rights. We are workers as well. We have the same rights as our white counterparts. And that's exactly what they did. And, we have John A. Robinson, who started this movement across the country, and a lot of union activities took place at the Porters Club, which is still standing. The building is still standing, I'll say, just off of Main Street in Higgins, not too far.
And I believe there's a drive to try and make that a Manitoba Heritage Building, I believe. I don't know if you're aware of that, but I've seen that recently, that they're trying to get that designation.
I think I've heard, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I've heard the talks of that underway. I think that's super important and significant. I can even think back to the summer when I was walking down into those areas. You would not know that that was a significant building to Manitoba history, Black history, also Canadian history.
Yeah, and I think that, and you think of the timing with that, and then 2 years later was like the Winnipeg general strike. So you just think of everything that was occurring in Winnipeg at the time, and I think a lot of people don't realize that. And that was cross-cultural, but just seeing how, the railway porters were one of the first to get ahead of that.
Yeah, exactly. It was quite an opportunity to jump on board, like talk of unionization has happened. Let's do something about this. Let's do something about our position. And they did win the rights and better wages and like that for the workers on those trains. It wasn't always, rainbows and roses, and it wasn't all dandy, but it was better than what they were before because of their because of their coming together and just being able to take risk and meeting even in a church building, which was Pilgrim Baptist Church, still standing
which
today,
I was
right?
which I was going to mention that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right. Kind of like undercover, very secretive, which I found was so exciting, and read this and learning about it, right? Because you would not think, okay, this is like 1900s, what's going on here in Winnipeg? Not too much, but there was some risky business happening.
Which I think we should shed light, because I know I'm assuming, like I've seen it, I'm assuming you've seen the series The Porter that was on CBC. So if anybody hasn't had a chance to check that series out, I thought it was really well done, and it shows just all of the things that were going on at that time. It was really interesting. So did you have any involvement in the production of that, or
No, I didn't. I didn't have an opportunity to part of that production,
Okay.
but I do know people who were on, who actually featured in the series, and I know their families who were part of it as well, just in conversation. But no, I wasn't part of that,
Okay.
unfortunately.
I had to ask, because I loved it, and it was a shame that it wasn't renewed, but just happy that they did get that first series out there. One thing I was going to ask, because you talked about in correct me if I'm wrong, or if you can shed any light. So we're talking about labor law, policy, Bill of Rights, but also immigration patterns, multiculturalism in Canada. Like, from what I've read, the Sleeping Porters were really instrumental in creating more of a multicultural society in Canada, because previous, say the early 1900s, like Canadian policy was almost like immigration whites only. But for porters, it was a lot of Black folks that they brought into those positions, and they had difficulty bringing family over, say from West Indies or different countries, and they really pushed to have families brought over. So is that something that you've read about or can expand on a little bit? Or if not to put you on the spot, like if it's something that, had you read much about that?
I can think of not too much. Like I do know about like immigration policies, like even after probably after I would think it was 1911, there was like even stricter policies and things like that that were really not admitting Black people into the country. Like I remember reading about a train full of like Black families ready to get off in Winnipeg, and there were, officers like restricting them, literally telling them, you're not allowed to get off this train. But I can't exactly recall what time that was, like that was like so after the 20s, if that was like in between kind of things happening before the unionization. Can't quite remember that piece, but I do remember reading things like that. And I know that, in how, imagine like you being in a country by yourself and working a terrible job that you don't
Yep.
want to be working, right?
Yep.
You're thinking you're coming here to build a better life for yourself and for your family, but not having your family, not being able to, talk to them, be with for years, right? I do think of one family that is quite instrumental and quite uh, active within the community, like within Winnipeg community for a numerous amount of years. I think of like the Williams family. So I don't know if you've heard of Judy Williams, but she and her family have had a rich history here in Winnipeg since like was it like the 1905s when her family first came here.
Okay.
And actually, in her story, I recently was watching a YouTube video about her story a little bit quick. And in her story, her family actually had quite a bit of wealth because someone in their family ended up inheriting diamonds, and
Oh,
then
wow.
those diamonds ended up being given to their family, and so they're able to come into Winnipeg like 1905. They started boarding house for Black families here in Winnipeg for those who didn't have anywhere else to go, right? They were able to come into these boarding houses, and that family is still here and still has quite a
Wow.
rich history in her. I remember Judy telling me how her grandfather was actually the exalted leader of the Elks
Oh,
fraternal
okay.
organization. Yeah, here in Winnipeg. I don't think they're an organization anymore.
No.
But yeah, right. Her grandfather was like the president or the exalted leader of that fraternal organization, and they did many things for their community. For those who didn't have families, for those who had kids, they had a women's auxiliary, I guess, committee or something like that. They also had something for like junior Elks thing for the young kids, and they brought the community together. So I think about like the families that were, maybe separated, right? But then other families that somehow had a wealth, or they could provide for the community, and they could be that like resilience and that strength and unity into their community through boarding houses and just having like an opportunity to go to a safe place, right? And I remember in reading something about the Elks, they often had like dance for their members, and they would come, and in one of the posters said that the dance was from like 9 till whenever. I thought that was just so great, right? You need that kind of uplifting
Oh, absolutely.
opportunity for the community, right? Especially at such a hard time. Jobs are tough, not being with family,
Yep.
but just to come together and feel that sense of pride and that sense of community and that sense of drive to do something so that your family can come to this place and hopefully it would be a better life. So I think of the Williams family, but I don't know too much of the research and the history of the immigration policies and like that. But I know that it's both ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and it is once again just shedding light on just how interesting the history of Winnipeg is and how multicultural it is. I just find
Mm-hmm.
that fascinating. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so thank you so much for your time. We're doing this right prior to Black History Month, and we were going to do this during Black History Month, but I think, like, from my perspective, with this story, this is something that should be acknowledged year round, so not just 1 month a
Mm-hmm.
year. Um, but if you had a take home for people, like this is the first time they're learning about this story, like what would be a take home message or to impart on people, or
Mm-hmm.
something to pique their interest to maybe look into this further? Like, what would be a take home message, just from your perspective,
Mm-hmm.
given the story of the porter in building Canada?
Mm-hmm. I always go back to this statement that Black history is Canadian history,
Mhm.
right? And just because of that alone, it made me want to know more and dive deeper. I grew up here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. My background is Caribbean, but and I thought a lot about, the history of the Caribbean folk who came maybe in the 60s, things like that. But I didn't know anything before that
Prior.
because it wasn't, prior to that, right? It wasn't, out there. I didn't learn about it. I didn't see pictures. I didn't hear stories. But just from a picture that I did find, or just from hearing this story, it made me want to go deeper because I realized Canada has this rich history of Black people in the communities. And it's something that we need to acknowledge and something that I believe should be taught in schools. I'm an educator. I strongly believe in creating a space for everyone and sharing stories. And so really the drive for me is that this is Canadian history and we don't know enough about it. Yes, sometimes it can be harsh reality, but there's all been a lot of resilience and a lot of how can I say, like a lot of pride and a lot of empowerment and a lot of drive that has taken young people like me in learning more about these histories and talking to the older people in our community, right? And hearing more, even if it's something difficult to hear sometimes, just being able to give a listening ear. So I really say the main take home is just being aware, being open, listening to stories, and to acknowledge that this is part of who we are and part of our Canadian history.
Absolutely. And yeah, just coming from my rail perspective and even Dauphin's history, I just feel like it's such an integral part of, because rail built Canada and who serviced the people that were on the trains that built Canada. So, so with that, thank you so much. I appreciate you allowing us just to speak a little bit and just trying to educate. And even though I'm not in education, but president of a museum, we're all about educating people about our history. As you said, some stories may be difficult, but it's just acknowledging that this is our history and learn from lessons from the past. Don't repeat some of the bad things. So anyways, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Listen to the whistle, Lordy, Lordy, what a thrill. I wish I was in Dixie with old Steamboat Bill. I plan off different stations as we roll along the line. I branch this thing to mission question, ain't the train on time? Is the train on time? I get that coat and hat. And see, boy, I don't know exactly where I'm at. Pullman Porter, turn on the light, and Pullman Porter, get me a bite, and Pullman Porter, all the whole night through. It seems I'm always wrong, whatever I do, in Pullman Porter. What town are we at, in Pullman Porter?